All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome again to another episode, our first episode in a long time of the actual Crowdsourced Politics podcast. Today, I am joined by Wordy. Just say something for
Oh,
the audio
yeah.
bit.
Hey there.
Travis Scott
Hey guys.
and CounterPoints.
Hey, what's up?
So if this is the first time you've joined one of the Crowdsourced Politics podcast, we try to do this once a month as an actual podcast. We also do a news roundup every Thursday from 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to roughly about 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we also do a foreign affairs, foreign policy podcast on the third Sunday of every month, which is roughly released on podcasts where you can get any of your podcasts at on the fourth Monday of every month. Today, we are going to be talking about police reform in light of COVID and the rise in crime therein, as well as the kind of things that we saw with the elections recently, how moderate Democrats tended to win with a better focus on police and what it could mean for police reform and what actual reforms work for getting police to have a better relationship with the community and also reduce crime. I'll let everybody introduce themselves a little bit. We'll just go from Wordy to Scott to CounterPoints. So Wordy, go ahead and please tell audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Wordy. Wordy talks to me on Talk Wordy to me. I'm a libertarian socialist. I'm a and prim in my head and calm in my heart. I basically want to improve people's lives, but you also have to work within the things you got to improve as much as you can. So that's kind of what I am.
Good deal. We're always glad to have you on, Wordy. So hopefully this will happen more often and I'll keep you in the loop. Travis, please go ahead.
Yep. I'm Travis Scott. Sort of like a techie amongst the circles. Also known as Raging Tiger from the Tiger Den, which is a gaming channel that is starting up on Facebook GG, as well as will be on YouTube. Also run a moto vlog. But yeah, as far as affiliation, I consider myself a moderate, not to be confused with centrist, but yes, pretty much a moderate politically.
And for those that might not know, Travis has been part of the Crowdsourced Politics community for a very long time, and it's always a pleasure to have you on, Travis. I'm glad that you're able to join us tonight.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Connor, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, buddy?
Yeah, so my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named CounterPoints. I identify as centrist, center right. I am a Marine veteran and a law enforcement veteran, so that's what I base a lot of my politics off of. I love yelling at people on the internet. I don't expect, this is a beautiful podcast. I don't expect to do too much yelling tonight. But I debate politics and talk shit, and it's my favorite thing to do. So thanks for having me, buddy.
Hey, you're always more than welcome to come on the show, Connor. This is I think your third time joining us, and so it's always a pleasure to have you as well. I'll give you a little bit about myself. My name is Cypher. I run the Crowdsourced Politics podcast, the Crowdsourced Tribune, not-for-profit. Kind of consider myself liberal to left, John Rawlsian. If anybody knows what that is, then you need to go touch grass as much as I do. And the reason that I am doing these kind of podcasts, especially with this in policing, is that I actually studied criminal justice in college. I also have a background in data science and data analysis. And so these are one of those things that I actually pay attention to and try to come up with policies and ways of fixing things. If we also did an episode way back in the day, as in last year, called CSP, Social Work as Policing, Conversation with Desmi Childs, who is also a member of our community and a social worker. And that's a really interesting conversation. And this is kind of a follow-up to that because of all the things that have happened since COVID and stuff like that. So kind of compare and contrast the two. Let us know what you think, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to play a quick video just for it and then do that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I think I want to start with Connor here for first off, just because he has direct a direct experience with policing can kind of give a little bit of background about that, what he has experienced there. And then we'll open it up to either Travis or Wordy to piggyback off of that. And then we'll start talking about like solutions and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and do that.
All right, cool. And then I'm just checking out the audio balancing, making sure that we're not, 10 different levels of whatever. But
Right.
Basically, yeah. So I worked as a law enforcement officer, and I saw a lot of really good things, and I saw a lot of really bad things. The way that we negatively impact people's lives is typically through the drug war, where if somebody is consuming marijuana in possessive quantities or like individual possession quantities in the state of Florida, at least up until very recently, without a medical card, we were still potentially giving you a civil citation or arresting people for that. Also, when it comes to drug distribution networks, it seems like marijuana in particular was the main thing, where there were people who were dealers, but who were otherwise, nonviolent and didn't seem to participate in drug cartels. And they would also catch very serious sentences and also have, basically enhancements to those sentences when they had firearms. So that's really my main concern. I'm for decriminalization of drugs. I am not for legalizing them. I don't think we should traffic anything. And I think that's the main way that the government kind of screws with its own citizenry, is through the drug war. When it comes to reform, there's a few things that I think could be really good, which, like, the war on drugs has obviously like upped the stakes of violence between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Whereas I think we could probably take a step back and say, what is the law enforcement purpose here? What is the actual criminal purpose that we're serving? Are we creating criminals, or are we deterring people from becoming criminals? I think those are important questions to answer with statistics. And particularly when it comes to like mental health crises, I think there's like a massive opportunity. Number one, for there to be better training for law enforcement as a whole. And number two, for there to be field social workers and field EMTs integrated into law enforcement itself. That way we can give people medical attention as quickly as possible. And then also, give people humane assistance during a mental health crisis, with a field social worker being on point, with a law enforcement officer being on standby. Some of the most egregious things that you've ever seen law enforcement do was when somebody was in a mental crisis and they treated it very poorly, I guess. So those are kind of my solutions. I'm not for defunding the police. I'm for refunding the police, and I'll leave it there.
All right.
Yeah, I'm gonna hop in on this.
Go for it.
Cypher, I fucking hate you, okay? You got sending me those studies. Like, so just to give some kind of context, I like to approach from more of an academic lens because, like, unfortunately, I don't have any of those experience. I will be studying like graduate school, like public policy and like JD shit, so like I can get from that perspective. But the studies I've been looking at, this motherfucker right here literally just sends like some studies on like policing. And so, like, as much as I may hate to say this, I'm not for defunding the police anymore because of the data I have. The data, the studies I have is like has some concerns about it, but it seems overall there is some level of investment that we can give to improve the policing itself. Like there is like the terror threat levels in Washington, where you could like have a identified relationship, and then there's like also better training. Like we can use a more higher standard of like restrictive use of force, which like leads to better outcomes in the end. So it seems to me generally, if we fund and like help refine the police programs, we have an improvement. But like just to understand, like improving the material conditions of like the people there, like it decreases crime a lot more, but also improving police practices also increases like the better behavior of the police student, leads to less crime as a whole.
Yeah, I'm sorry to have like just inundated you with all the data that I've been sitting on for like a decade, but it had to be done. I'm sorry, buddy. Like
there's some concerns I have on like the applicability just across the United States,
sure.
And like reliability. I'll have to look into that more, but like these fucking studies are just like, fuck you, man.
Travis, what is on your mind?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much in 90%, like 99% agreement with Connor. Like exactly how he had presented it. I'm pretty much in agreement with that. I was never really big on the whole defund the police slogan, because coming from experience, I grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland most of my life, but just a heartbeat away from DC. And I remember the way DC was like growing up in the 90s. Like there was this period where DC was considered like the murder capital of the country during the height of the crack epidemic. And he dovetailed that nicely with the drug war. A lot of that was due to the drug war and how it negatively impacted inner city communities such as DC. So while everybody likes to bring up the negative aspects of the crime bill, for example, which were there, the fact of the matter is the situation of the community at that time was dire, and there were a lot of things that, as a result of that, as a result of the step up in policing, it allowed DC to sort of recover and become the more peaceful community that it is. It's not perfect by any means right now. As far as his position, I'm all 100% for the decriminalization of drugs as well. I would argue that there is a case for legalization to be made in the case of marijuana, besides the fact that, yes, it has medicinal purposes. There's, of course, the CBD industry, which is now a thing where I am in North Dakota, just surprising. So even though marijuana is not legal in North Dakota, CBD is. But I would argue that legalization of marijuana would, one, allow it to be properly regulated, and two, it has more of a large benefit to the community in ways of taxation, ways of, reducing the nonviolent arrests and everything as a result of marijuana. And then also the things that we don't think about, such as the bioplastics industry. Legalizing cannabis would allow the hemp industry to thrive, which would give us an alternative over the plastics and PFAS and a lot of the things that we are now realizing negatively affect our health long term. So, yeah.
No, I think that's a good wrap for that. I also agree with basically decriminalizing drugs. I'm probably more for legalizing drugs than Connor or probably Travis is, but I am not for legalizing hard drugs, at least not fully. And I say that because even though I know there's like the Portugal study and there's a couple of other studies that came out of Latin America that showed that legalization actually reduced harm across the board. There is a cultural element of drug use, and that cultural element needs to be like studied further. And by that, what I mean by a cultural element, I mean like, the main reason that people take drugs is because of, like Wordy would say, their material conditions, dropping in, dropping out, or whatever the term was in the 70s where everybody just took a bunch of drugs and then like just floated. I think that needs to be studied more and actually corrected it before we legalize drugs. So I don't want to see the harm increase of just legalizing drugs and a bunch of people taking them and becoming addicted, especially with opioids. So if it's a hard drug, if it's a physically addicting drug, I don't think I'd for legalization of that. But for the milder drugs, and at least getting rid of Schedule 1 for marijuana and LSD, so that we can research those drugs for medical purposes, such as helping with depression, PTSD, that sort of thing, and pain management when it comes to marijuana. That we have that. Now, to give additional context here, the reason that Wordy said basically "fuck you, buddy" is because I dropped a ton of links for him, for them, when they asked on Twitter where was I getting my information, and one of the primary things that work in order to reduce crime, and I want to kind of talk about this, why that's the case, is the presence of policing as a deterrent, or police as a deterrent, and why that might be the case. And so, Wordy, you read all those links more recently than I have. So I'm going to go ahead and have you talk about that a little bit, and then we can have Connor talk about it, and then we can give our takes about that.
Yeah. So to generally summarize, the studies kind of like just indicate basically like levers of it's like a boiling pot, right? You look at different levers. Like we have the levers of like better welfare policies, better social work, and like better policing. And so like one of the main thing about the studies was talking about like the mere police presence seems to have like a deterring effect based on like the measurements they provide. The question I would have about the studies is like proportionality to like races. So like that's where the kind of concern is. Like we may have an overall like decrease, which is like good. It's just the concern is about proportionality, and that's where the issue comes. Is like these racial biases that exist in the system seem indicate a proportion like greater to harm to like Black communities. But if you can like affect the policy to where you can decrease that like bias, then you can like produce better outcomes while also maintaining police presence. So like its basic understanding is like, while police presence has a decreasing effect, it's not a perfect decrease, but it has an important and significant decrease, which is important.
All right, Connor, would you like to piggyback off of that?
Yeah, so that's kind of like my frustration, as the enlightened centrist or whatever. That's my fucking frustration is like, we can let data drive our decisions in this kind of things, where we can say like, hey, listen, like, call it culture, call it disparate outcomes, call it systemic racism, call it whatever the fuck you want to call it. But we got problems, and those problems can be ameliorated through basically good governance. And I think that we're a little bit coming out of the Reagan era fiscal conservatism that basically says, oh, anytime you get the government involved at all, it's automatically a negative. Doesn't matter if you're literally like taking millions of dollars and giving it to starving people in order to help them. It's actually bad for the government to be doing that in the first place, because society has to do its own thing without your help. Has to do its own thing without your help. And like on one hand, like that's cool, but that doesn't mean that we don't have real problems that need addressing and that are impossible to address. So that's kind of my frustration is I just want Republicans to stop saying like, oh, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And then I want leftists and progressives to stop pretending that like every single cop wakes up every single day in order to fuck people of color over. I think that would be like a good starting place for dialogue. Unfortunately, last point is like, I feel like this kind of conversation where we're actually being like, I don't know, sober adults and talking about our problems and the solutions that might actually solve them, they're not as sexy as just getting on the internet and yelling at each other. And that's part of our problem as well.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
I was just saying.
If Travis wants to hit it up, I was just going to say, like, I always have like my ideological perspective, right? I don't have any love for the state. I don't have any love for the cops as an institution, but unfortunately, I have to set that aside just a little bit in order to like look at data, look at how statistics work, and like basically is like just there's an indication that like at least some level of police presence. Now I don't know what the threshold is, and that would be like something to be concerned about. Is like what threshold do we eventually have like negative effects, right? But I also like understand like the emotional component, right? Is like the police do fuck up a lot, and we understand the emotional side where the like emotional foundation is defunding the police is like valid, right? And so from there is like I would say is like we want to drive like more community policing, because like there was that one study in the things you sent that seems to indicate like it improves it because it's the relationship that occurs, right? A lot of cops have negative relationships because they're so like disconnected, and from that it makes it easier for this like aggressive environment to exist. And while I have no love for like these institutions, I understand is if I'm going to exist in these institutions, I want them to like interact with me more like personally without having to like go automatically to like violent levels. And I think that's important to understand.
Well, half meme. So do you mean like community policing, like militias like take over the streets? Or are you talking about community policing, like we have better law enforcement actually doing jobs like, and interacting with the community?
If the militias were actually good at their job, but they never are really. So yeah.
Just half meme.
Half meme.
No, I got you.
Look, full meme. Okay, cops are actually malicious, but that's a joke. It also. Sorry, you go. It really depends on. Sorry,
Wordy, you just said you go.
Sorry, you go. Go.
All right, so we'll go Travis, and then Wordy, you can continue on, and then I'll break in.
Yeah. So you highlighted a good point perfectly, which is the conservative. And sometimes this is also the case with the left as well, that sort of brought about the whole defund the police thing, which is that the resources that we have to bear in a community is finite. So we have to either throw everything in the kitchen sink in terms of funding at police, or we have to throw everything in the kitchen sink toward economic issues. And the truth of the matter is we need both, and there's no reason in the world why we can't do both. So we have to look at everything from a balanced approach. Another thing is you have to have a check and balance as in authority from the police. So one suggestion which I had liked, which was proposed by Yang when he was running for mayor in New York, was having a civilian police chief, very similar to how, in the military we have a civilian component that's in charge of the military, just so you have that sort of balance. Because while you can set out to have the most honest police department in the world, we do have to be realistic and seeing that there is a sort of incestuous relationship between district, state, and federal prosecutors and police, and there's sort of an incentive to sort of have high conviction rates to sort of rack up prosecutions. If there is a way to sort of split that balance so that police are less incentivized to go out looking for crimes and more so just look out and protect the community, I think that would help tremendously. But also, everyone has to acknowledge that there is pretty much a direct correlation between communities that are economically underserved and the crime rate. When you have places with very little opportunity, very little chance for economic mobility and growth, oftentimes people lead that to crime. And then when you throw the drug war on top of that, it just multiplies and exacerbates everything and just metastasizes.
Yeah, so like basically is there's all these summaries that exist is like we understand like the police is like my whole desire is always to like have communities or have people like be able to deal with those issues before we have to rely on institutions, because the problem with those institutions is the level of like accountability that you have for me, and that's always a concern. Is like you can elect like the police chief, you can elect them and like municipal or county level, and like the problem comes is a lot of police aren't elected, and that makes it harder for like a citizen to like directly hold them accountable. You have to like use like a mediary. But then there's also the aspect we have to understand is like, a lot of people draw their attention to like the worst examples, like Los Angeles, unreformable, fuck that shit, like okay, Los Angeles literally
it's pretty bad.
It's really bad. So like we have to understand is like basically like this is the problem with lefties sometimes, like where I emotionally understand where like you have these worst moments of like policing behavior, and then we have like the middle ground where a lot of bad shit happens, but it's not like directly organized front of like fucking white supremacists or some shit, and that's the problem. Is we have to understand is the institution has a lot of racial biases, but these worst examples we have to like basically set those aside. Like those are bad, but we have to look at like the average ones and like understand those relationships and understand is like, hey, you want to not have to rely on police more, better welfare policies, so we can like have people take more initiative in their communities before we have to defer to the police, right?
Sure.
Okay, so just to kind of get in here, because like law enforcement for me anyways, the fear with like civilian oversight, like even me, it just gives me a little bit of anxiety. It's just having people who like are telling you how to do your job who have never done it before. And I'm not saying that law enforcement isn't rocket science, but I am saying that it's super easy to kind of like judge something when you don't have like adrenaline coursing through your veins and you're missing like a lot of like emotional context. And you can kind of watch like a 3 to 5 minute video of one of the worst interactions of your life where somebody got hurt or killed, and there's no basically there's no replacement, at least from a law enforcement perspective, for experience. Like experience, part of the reason why cops want to be judged by other cops is because they want somebody who's had that in their life before. And so what I would kind of propose as an alternative to that, you could do like a civilian oversight board that was like 60% law enforcement veterans, 40% civilians, who were looking at like, helping write policy and all that kind of stuff. Another thing that you could do that's actually one of the main problems is third-party accountability. So my issue with third-party accountability is that if I wanted to report like nefariousness that like another cop was doing, the people that I report to are my chain of command. Well, guess what? Like law enforcement is just as much as a nepotistic and incestuous political organization as anything else. So if they like the person that I'm saying like, hey, they're fucking up this thing, that thing, the other thing, it's really shady, I don't like it, then I can become the problem more than the problem person. Whereas if you have a third party institution, my recommendation being the state police, and then having like an individual wing that's actually responsible for investigating law enforcement officers. In the state of Florida, municipal and county police are already terrified of state law enforcement. If you had a corruption, malfeasance, and brutality wing of the state police, that would actually be a really good way, one, to disincentivize bad behavior, and then two, investigate negative behavior objectively. That way you didn't have all these police departments covering up their own bullshit.
No, let me bring in. So I 100% agree with Connor on that one. So a little bit of background: when I was studying criminal justice in school, it was a substantive criminal law kind of perspective, which is basically seeing how law and communities interact, law enforcement, jails, etc. interact, and as well as being the legal framework, of law itself. And it was also really focused on community policing because I went to college 2004 to 2008, where community policing was still all the rage. And one of the things that I never particularly liked about the community oversight boards when they were coming up as a thing for, back 3-4 years ago, is the same kind of thing that Connor had said. Monday night quarterbacking is a very big issue. And one of the things that we could do in order to tamp down on that, it's not necessarily have a 60-40 split about that, but have experts on payroll in order to give them the insights, like you would have an expert witness at a trial. And so you have the community oversight board listening to experts witnesses about a particular thing, and then they would be able to make the decisions similar to a court of law. And then you would take whatever the process is, whether it's police union process or what have you, and have that filter through the community oversight board with those experts that are on payroll. One other thing is that I 100% like the idea of taking the internal affairs outside of the policing apparatus itself and putting that into the Department of Justice. And for that, what I mean is similar to what Connor said, is that you have multiple tiers going up, of each one investigating the next one down. So you have an internal affairs that's part of the Department of Justice on the national level, and they investigate things that the state is, washing their hands of, similar to how we have civil rights investigations. And then down the line it goes, because states typically, because of funding and other things, typically mirror what the federal government does. So you have an IA on the state level within the state's Department of Justice investigating local city, municipality, and then municipality investigates the sheriff, so on and so forth. And I think that would actually do a lot of positive good in this regard, and being able to take away the corruption aspect of that. So I wanted to say that my piece. Go
Travis,
ahead,
you want to go first, Travis? I thought you were trying to say something.
Okay.
So, this is the problem is, so from my perspective, right, as a civilian, as a person who is so the problem that comes for me is when we talk about judging civilians who don't understand the job, don't have that experience, right? Is even though we may not have that experience, we're still the direct effect of your policing, right? We are directly responsible. And so from my perspective, the problem that comes is as we defer more and more to higher authorities, the ability for you as a citizen or as a community to account, directly check that, the community board and the whole idea of bringing in experts to make sure you can get some perspective, that sounds good to me. The problem that comes is we see is even though we have more a lot of internal services of checking and stuff, there is some degree of that, but there's also external services, and we see the external services. The problem is the relationship that exists with attorneys is the relationship is already they rely on each other, so you don't want to call each other out, because the minute you call each other out, they'll fucking screw you over. And that's the problem in the relationship is these things occurring. We already see some example of that. So basically from my perspective, it's I want us to be able to have more transparency to the system at least, but also be able to vote more, have directly elective processes, because even though people are stupid because they're product of their circumstances, but understanding is if you are being directly affected by the processes, I feel you should at least have a say. It goes farther than more than no taxation without representation. It's hey, if you're going to police my ass, I want to at least be able to see where the ass is getting hit, that's just the understanding.
And I do think there is some measure of results, of positive results, when positions like police chief and sheriffs are elected positions, because they their accountability is more palpable to the public. So
It depends.
I can agree with that.
I don't see. For me, it feels like super hollow, and like I'm not trying to be like mean or anything, but like the basically for me, it's like we have elected sheriffs. They're just as big a dicks as fucking police chiefs. Like they are no better, and like elected. Elections or whatever, oftentimes what we're talking about, particularly with like police reform, is we're talking about like normie. No offense to anybody, but we're talking about like normie boomers who vote more than young people. So we're not talking about the people who are being policed. We're not talking about the people who are in the poorer communities. We're not talking about the people who are being systemically oppressed, who are the voters. We're basically talking about normie boomers. That's who's doing this shit. So if you making it an elected position, well, if your voting base is still disproportionately conservatives who don't give a shit about any of these things, then your elected official is going to be just as bad as anybody else. So that's where for me it really does boil down to unfortunately it's like very obvious to me, and it's kind of a shame that it's not already in place, considering the history of what's been going on in this country for the past couple of years. But universal body cams, third-party accountability, and then I'm trying to think of what else, but community policing, which like I'm not trying to say in the meme way, kind of like I think CSP kind of alleged that like community policing isn't going to solve all your fucking problems. But re-looking at the drug war, that's like one of the big things. Because like, how the fuck are we still arresting teenagers for drug crimes, for marijuana in 2021? Like I know that like disproportionately it's probably like civil citations and shit, but what a waste of the court's time, energy, and resources, and what a waste of like law enforcement manpower. And if I could just
100%.
indulge for like another 30 seconds, the people who get promoted are the drug warriors. Those are the people who get promoted because they can show statistically that they are being aggressive about policing. But I've talked about this in the past. If you're a drug warrior, you shove your hands down somebody's pockets, you arrest somebody, you take them to jail, then at that point, you're off the road and your fucking zone is getting fucking ransacked.
Yep.
So it actually has very little to do with policing the drug war.
Okay, so like, if you want to go, Travis.
Yeah. So I want to touch back on the point you made about the sheriffs and the sheriffs being dick. So there's two things with that. One, as you probably know, usually when sheriffs are up for re-election in the areas where they're the most egregious, they're usually in areas where the turnout is extremely low. Most people aren't even keeping up or paying attention to the fact that there are sheriffs in an election. And as a result, most sheriffs in these places, when they run for that position, they typically run unopposed, number one. And number two, sheriffs in you could probably speak to this as well, but in the world of policing, sheriffs are in a unique position where they have way more power than your average cop, your average sergeant, or officer on the beat. So the amount of authority that they have is, you can't really compare that to a traditional police officer as well. So you've got this 1-2 punch of, they don't have a whole lot of accountability because of the way turnout and people's participation in the election of sheriffs is very low. So 10 people show up to vote, which is usually like a buddy of theirs and a couple people that they greased, the palms of, they get elected. And then the other thing is, once you're in sheriff, like at any point of, and we've seen this in examples like with Sheriff Arpaio and others, you really don't have to answer to a lot of the prosecution and state court's resources, because bitch, I'm the sheriff. This position, sheriffs existed in a lot of places. The office of sheriff existed before there was actually a agency or a law enforcement body. So because the sheriff supersedes that, the possibility for corruption is just way higher.
No, 100%. And I think that's why I'm going to reiterate again. I think it's very important to have in the Department of Justice a police oversight board and an actual investigation wing. I think it's necessary. I think a lot of the problems that we have with police corruption and civil rights violations could be remedied if we had it within the FBI, the Department of Justice, somewhere, a top level looking down just to investigate police corruption.
But don't we
like as their
those?
only thing?
No,
not as a separate department.
Can I address that? Because basically what we were told while we were training was like, hey, don't speed on the highway. If you get pulled over by state police, then you need to be super fucking polite, because basically state police don't give a shit. They don't. Like, they don't care that you're a cop. And that's something that the state police were told, was that, like, you are the only accountability system for these fucking good old boy law enforcement officers. So you have to treat them like regular citizens. Otherwise, they're going to do some wild shit, and they're going to rely on you being a cop in order to not do your job. And so that's where some people, some cops are like, oh, the thin blue line isn't as much as it used to be, or whatever like that. And they kind of pine for the days where basically like cops like would cover up for each other's bullshit. But realistically, like, I think you kind of need to take a look at that, because that's the way cops viewed it, is like, oh, if I fuck up too hard, state police are going to come after me. And that can kind of make you check yourself on whether or not you have that, like, good old boy, I can't be touched, thin blue line shit. And so naturally extrapolating that out at the state level and the federal level, I think is just like, it's logical. And final point is just like, power abhors a vacuum. And basically, like, the only way to check power is with additional power. I know, as an anarchist, fucking Wordy hates that shit. But that's part of the reason why I think anarchism is kind of a pipe dream, is because I think that power has to check power. So a state level institution basically telling law enforcement what they can and can't do, and especially made up of cops who have served as law enforcement in the past. I think you could get rid of a lot of egregious behavior with that kind of check.
Okay, look, I understand it's a pipe dream, but I think it's a useful analysis to understand, like, power check power. Who checks that other power? Like, that's the problem in the
more power.
Who watches the Watchmen?
No, you literally just like go into infinity of more power, but at the end of the day,
correct.
It's like Dragon Ball Z, and we just end up going super, and it's all good.
But that's the problem. Is like your average fucking citizen, like, they're the people who matters in this situation, because they're the ones who are being policed. They're the ones who are having to follow the laws. They're the ones being, like, affected by these programs that are being prescribed. And if you don't have, like, a serious way, and then we understand, like, low voter turnout, like, isn't important. We need to get more people involved in that process. We have to understand is the system. We have to, like, affect the system, so when we do get those better turnouts, we can better have results.
But can we be real? Can we be real for a second? The system, as ugly as it is working out particularly for white folk, and for most folk, okay. It's not great. No, more people want to speed, that's for sure. More people want to smoke pot without fear of harassment. Most people want to be able to get drunk and get into fist fights without having to fear somebody else coming in order to fuck them over. But you don't like the part of the problem is, like, we have this groundswell of, like, cultural narrative that, like, everybody is just on the verge of, like, I can't say that for Twitch. Everybody is on the verge of violent revolution. And it just doesn't seem to reflect in reality. So the truth is, if you want popular support, if you want people to do this kind of stuff, then you have to sell these ideas to normie boomers. I know that's so boring for all of the fucking Twitch anarchists and communists, but it's true. And guess what? If you know what fucking normie boomers are worried about? They're worried about their fucking DUI. They're worried about them smoking pot and getting fucked over because, let's face it, most boomers were from the hippie generation. So they're worried about getting fucked over something that they don't see as a real crime. You have to make it real for them. And God damn it, here's a little bit of a take. You have to show prosecutorial malfeasance, like in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, which I'm sure we don't necessarily agree on. When the prosecutor is being shady as piss, you got to show that shit and say, like, hey, this is how the system works. So if you don't want that, then you gotta fucking be more mindful about what's actually going on in the system.
So, Connor,
Go ahead if it's quick, and then Travis goes, and then I want to break.
I literally gave you everything you wanted. Better police presence. I don't know how much more normie boomer shit you want from me. Like,
no, I mean this is great, Wordy. I'm happy that we're not creating
I
anarchist militias.
I understand. Like, basically, if we understand, like, the whole revolution, it's not actually happening. A lot of people are like, about everything
anytime soon, and that's not to say that like you couldn't have some kind of. We all hook up our brains.
Finish, but I love you to death when you finish. Basically, it's understand. It's like always from the perspective is like, even though we may not have the issues now, but I think like offloading more elective, like ultimately, I think more democracy, like basically improves the possibilities. It doesn't fix the issues, but because you are able to offload like accountability factors, right? You talk about accountability, power to power, but also the important part is making sure we keep power at least in the people, because if you maintain that power on some extent, then it makes it easier for these corrupt practices to occur, right? A lot of police officers and like these technocratic processes aren't elected, at least democratically, and that creates issues in the whole relationship.
Well, so
go ahead, Travis.
The point you made about the system that we have now has benefited, most of our people, and then other groups about okay. I would put an asterisk there as long as you live in a halfway decent neighborhood. If you were in West Baltimore, you're really it's not so much. If you were across the Anacostia in DC, not so much. If you're some parts of Jacksonville, Florida, even parts of Houston, like Third Ward, not so much. But and we have to look at when you have a economically underserved area, you have to look for other solutions besides just the police. Because if I want to try to just exist, it is incredibly maddening and stressful to exist in an environment like that. I'm just trying to get by about my day. I get it that the cops are trying to make sure that the bad guys are off the street, but when you're in a when you're in an economic underserved community with a high crime rate, and you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we have to address the fact that, hey, we got to fix the fact that people need stuff to do, and there needs to be opportunity here. And so there has to be other resources that you're throwing in this area besides police.
Yeah, and can I want to make the case for systemic racism to the few conservatives in my audience. When you said those points, what I wanted to acknowledge was the fact that like most people or a decent chunk of people who are like normie boomers, kind of like I was saying, they don't give a shit about this. And so, for instance, like in my area, I live in Orlando. All of like 90% of our homicides happen on the west side of I-4. The west side of I-4 is basically our segregated, not in a intentionally segregated, but historically segregated area. And as a result of that, we just don't care because it's not our community. So, gotcha. But it's Orlando, but we just don't care because that's where the homicides happen. That's where the poverty is. That's where the bad schools are. That's where this is. And so that would be my challenge for the conservative audience is like, if you're like, oh yeah, like, this is bad, but I mean, realistically, who gives a shit? That's part of the problem is you don't give a shit about basically other people getting screwed over simultaneously by lack of opportunities and poor schools and poor communities, but also law enforcement coming in and because they're fighting the drug war, screwing over, basically marijuana consumers, alcohol consumers, and also people trying to get about their day who might have or might be a perfectly good driver, but have their driver's license suspended due to lack of insurance because they're poor, and then get arrested because they're driving without insurance. And like that's the kind of things that you can see spiral out of control is just exactly what I said. And then you ask yourself as a cop, when you arrest these people, it's like, whom am I serving right now? Definitely not this person that I'm taking to jail who's driving to work. But I am arresting them because they have too many suspensions on their driver's license. So yeah, that's frustrating.
It is. And so I just want to do a shout out real quick. So 10 Flicks says Wordy is the most friendly governance anarchist he's ever met, but I love him anyways. Well,
he wasn't this friendly a few months ago, okay?
Well, that's because I have to think through positions. And basically, I have to understand is like I ain't gonna fix the issues like through my own fucking revolution or whatever. But I have to understand is like use that perspective, use it on like analyze the systems. And like that's basically how it comes down to. And I visited Orlando, and I had an ex who lived there, and like you can see like as you kind of cross the highway, there's like a difference in like the neighborhood, at least from a tourist perspective. It's like really interesting, and like coming from like where I live, it's like the liberal city of the like fucking world. And like what's interesting is like even though like there probably isn't as much issues here, is like the kind of like level of like transparency that exists. Like for example, if you want to see like how they analyze like how they do like call out rates for like the fire department versus like the police, you can say okay, that's interesting, but then it's really harder to like have a direct measurement of like who gets arrested and like the consistency, and so you have to like defer to like a third website. So like that's really frustrating to get an understanding, like at least from an academic perspective, how disproportionate the outcomes are, and like saying, hey, what are your police policies, where are your police routes going, because that shit isn't available on like the websites, you know.
And then like one other thing he says, for clarity's sake, it's not much of criticism, more of a props for pragmatism. So there you go, you got a friend. So I wanted to break in. So what Travis has said and what Connor has said about the necessity of ensuring some sort of equality in policing outcomes and caring about people that may not live near you. I think I'm going to turn some of this conversation on its head a little bit, because I want people to think about this. And so instead of defund the police, I think we need to fund criminal justice in its entirety. And that's going to take a lot more money. And this is why I'm saying that. For a lot of people that may not know, part of the reason that we had so much unrest after in Minnesota,
George
Floyd, Minneapolis,
Minneapolis,
etc., is because the local police departments were using their citizens as ATM machines. They were essentially tax collectors going out and harassing people in order to fund their services. We have this as a quota system in a lot of areas. Now, I don't know if Connor has had any experience with this, but I know that a lot of states that implemented zero tolerance policing after Rudy Giuliani they did it in such a way that they also use it to pad their tax revenues. And when you do that and you have these quotas, you are creating a negative incentive in order to fund your services to go after poor people that can't fight these things, so that you can continue to rake in money. And they do that in order to not have to pay for things. So we have things like court fees. You get pulled over by the police and you get a speeding ticket. You're going to pay that $250 speeding ticket, depending on where you're at. Then you're going to pay $110 on court fee, and you're going to pay another clerk fee. And then it ends up a $250 ticket. It's going to be like $550.
That's why most people just pay the ticket. Whatever, I'll take the plea and the points.
Yeah.
Let me just pay this $250 and not,
Exactly. Not try to fight it. And then in Texas, in some areas in Texas, even if you don't fight the ticket, say you're speeding over, I think it's over 10% of the speed limit in Texas, or 20%. It's some weird number. You have to go to court, even if you're pleading no contest. And so you
got your loony bin Commonwealth places like Virginia, where up until recently, like you could be actively serving in the Navy. And I know I have one guy, shout out to T1, he knows who he is. But if you had a speeding ticket and a court date, you could be in ship movement. And you have to figure out a way to get from your ship to Virginia to attend the court.
Jesus.
Pay whatever court fees or deal with whatever sentence you got to deal with. Then get back on the ship and back to the mission. They finally got rid of that, but Virginia, man, these Commonwealth states are crazy.
Yeah, actually, I think there might have been a warrant out, because like I got a ticket in the city of Houston before I was a law enforcement officer, and I'm pretty sure they sent me a notification like, don't come back to Texas because there's a warrant. I was like, all right, I guess I'm just not coming back then. And then they forgot about me, so now it's not a big deal. But still, like, that's like the ridiculous thing. It's like I got a ticket because I was driving cross country. And since I was driving cross country, you think I'm going to stop and give you $200 I don't have, you know, while I'm moving. Hell no, you come and get me, bitch. And like that's like that's actually the attitude. I think the correct attitude of a lot of citizens when they feel like they're getting treated as disposable ATMs or whatever is like, you can't bleed a stone. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to make me more broke than I already am? And that's kind of like the shitty thing to say, you know, coming from a point of privilege. You know, it's like, it's super easy when you have money and you're middle class and you actually have a savings account to say, oh, I got $200. Yeah, I'll pay that ticket, whatever. It's a lot harder when you are the broke person who literally, it's like, not only do I not have the $200 now, I'm going to be $100 behind every month for the rest of my month. And it's just a question of what gets shut off when and how I catch up when I catch up. And so I've lived like that. And because I've lived like that, I'm actually very sympathetic to a lot of people when it comes to this kind of crap, where it's just like, yo, like, why am I going to take you to jail for a driver's license suspension? I have to. Unfortunately, in some circumstances, it's not even possible for me to look the other way. But if I can look the other way, I will. Whereas other cops, because it's a numbers game, they won't look the other way because it's a stat for them to look good on their reports. And just to answer the question about the quotas, I never had a quota, but I was supposed to do 3 stops every shift. And you better believe, because I did 3 stops every shift, we found some shit. You know,
so, that's a quota right there. You had to do 3 stops no matter what.
I didn't have to write tickets, but it was still not great.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, the fact that they forced you to look, I mean, granted, they want people to be proactive police, so I kind of get it. But the fact that you had to stop 3 people, even if you didn't see anything, is kind of.
Oh, you as a cop, you're going to see some shit, and that's where.
Well,
like,
yeah, but you get what I'm saying.
No, I do get what you're saying, but it's so interesting when like they're like, oh, cops are just running around like making shit up, and I'm like, yeah, maybe in a small community, but for me, it's like, you know, I trip on my dick and I find crime. So the point being,
stop committing more crime. I don't know.
Stop
being a criminal.
There's like 20 ways you could have went with that.
But
where was it? Where was it?
But the point being, other people committing crimes. So basically, like the overall point being that like. But the corruption in law enforcement is really, like, it's a really frustrating conversation, because I think there's a real conversation to be had where there's serious corruption, and then I think there's a serious conversation to be had where there's minor corruption, where cops are padding stats, or they're exaggerating reports in order to get convictions, or they're just thinking about the drug war not in a term of like, how am I serving my community in order to reduce drug trafficking and drug consumption, but how do I get a statistical arrest in order to show that I'm the coolest cop to, you know, since like fucking Clint Eastwood, I forget the goddamn movie, Dirty Harry. Yeah. And that's like, and that's kind of the world that we live in, unfortunately, where not a lot of people are mindful about what they're doing.
Yeah, so like the problem that comes in the perspective is, I think like, you think about a cop, right? Is you think about like getting, like, you can think, okay, from a cop, you're thinking, if I have more arrests, I'm doing my job, right? And the whole problem is like, when you have like measuring like how effective your relationship is, like if you're a good cop, nothing happens, right? You want nothing to happen, but the problem comes is like, you think is like, from your cop perspective, you're like, hey, if I arrest more people, it means I'm protecting the community better. Like, it doesn't even require like you to be an asshole. It just requires you to like think from that perspective. And that's the problem in the relationship. Is I would also be curious is like, what degree of like funding goes through like the ticket process, is like how much of that like contributes to like police funds. And that's like curious where those like incomes and everything's go.
That would depend on the community. I know that Ferguson, that was the fucking place I couldn't think of. God forbid, right? But Ferguson, it was like 20% of the budget or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and my community was not that bad. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was something. It was ridiculous. It was a huge percentage of the budget. Yeah. And so, right there, like that's a problem, right? So
I would say at least we got to move away from these metrics. Like, measuring your success by conviction rate is flawed. You know, I would hate to be. I would hate to be so like Japan, for example, I would hate to measure things the way Japan does, because Japan has something like a 99% conviction rate. But the thing is it's yeah, there's tons of horror stories of like both foreigners and nationals in Japan where like you get into a fight with someone, people are like, "Look, I'll do anything. We'll settle it out of just don't press charges," because especially if you're a foreigner, even if you didn't start the fight, you could just, be walking down the street, you run into a junker. He's Japanese, you're not. He swings at you, decks you, whatever, you guys get into a fight. But then the cops come, he's like, "Yeah, this guy, you don't speak the language, it's hard for you to defend yourself." They got a 99% conviction rate, so you're screwed. So we got to move away from those metrics.
Yeah.
Well, and what I was going to say very specifically is that like the metrics that we do need to look at are actually crime. So for instance, like burglary, theft, that absolutely should be the way that we evaluate success, because if somebody is patrolling their zone the way that they're supposed to, then they will have a negative effect on burglary and property crimes, because they're actually doing their fucking job. Whereas if they have like a bunch of arrests, but they basically like arrested like a bunch of pot dealers or a bunch of fucking whatever, or not even pot dealers, like pot heads, then they have a bunch of great arrests, but they basically they haven't done shit, and then you'll actually see the crime rate spike because they weren't doing their fucking job. They were pretending to do their job, which is super frustrating.
And that's exactly what happens. And like, so take Houston, for example, when I lived in Alameda, Genoa, which isn't, it's not third ward, but it wasn't a terribly great neighborhood. But that was the issue. Like when my car got broken into or any other issues in the community, you called police to take them, 20 to 45 minutes to get there. But man, some guy with a joint in his hand, he's ready, he gets picked up right away. Like, forget this. He is not the problem. The guy smoking pot didn't rob me. Get the guy that robbed me. And it's
I got an anecdote to back his point up real quick though. So one of my oldest brother from my dad's first marriage is a piece of shit. All right. He stole my car with my keys and took it somewhere. And I didn't hear from it or anything for like 4 or 5 weeks, right? I reported him to the police. I'm like, I know who stole my car. I want my car found. Here's what's going on. I get a letter in the mail from a mechanic's lien saying, unless you come and pay this $700, $800 fine, we're going to sell your car and you're not going to get it back. Turned out that he took my car, put it at somebody else's driveway, had somebody else call it and report it as abandoned. So somebody would come pick it up. And the cops, when he got arrested for a B&E. The cops didn't even come to me and be like, "Hey, what about this other charge about your brother?" They didn't do anything to look for the car, nothing. And so, like, to your point, like, come on, like, fucking don't get it.
So there's two things I want to say. First off, it sounds to me like we just want to get rid of Texas. Okay, Texas just fucking.
Oh, this happened in okay, true, but this happened in Indiana.
But two is there's also the issue of like when you have like. While this is like very specific in Texas, you could talk to Spectre about this, Connor, if you want. But like whenever cops have like white supremacist groups exist, and then they just don't do anything, like literally there was a video like back in where like portion of Texas where we have like literally like Nazis or like big like Texas hats wearing Nazi symbols, literally like hanging like signs over like highways, like illegal.
Oh, yeah.
Like in Jewish communities, like this is also really frustrating. Is like when you have like these hate groups that exist, and then these just don't do anything, and it's like, what the hell, man? And it's like, it's just like really messed up too.
Yeah, and then I do have the hard out, so I do got to jump. So
okay, we'll go ahead and we can go ahead and wrap it up. Does anybody have a final thought they want to leave this before we go?
I was going to say there's a lot of productive ground to go on. We'll probably on Twitch Politics, we'll still be fighting for fucking the next like a year about how all cops are pieces of shit and we need to nuke the system and have the communist revolution and like all that kind of stuff. But what I would say before I jump out is basically like there are things we can do. field social workers, universal body cameras, third-party accountability. These are things to press on in your local politics. These are things to consider when you're having discussions. We can be pragmatic. We can improve the system. And then also everybody was mentioning the systemic issues or whatever. If you have like 2 hours, this is something that I'm trying to push in my community, especially once COVID is done, is if you have a couple hours a week and it's extra, instead of doom scrolling, do something in your community. If that's like mentoring a younger person or reaching out to your city council or something like that, then take that energy that you would have spent just arguing on Twitter and actually spend it locally.
100%. Anybody else? If not, I'll wrap it there.
I mean, yeah, basically like attend your county council meetings, attend your city council meetings, like very minimum go to the main city council meeting so you can be aware of what stuff, and it's so much fun to watch. They are such like dramatic and I love it. It's such drama. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. Just like get involved in the decisions that are being made in your community, because like to go back with, you mentioned Ferguson. For the biggest problem with Ferguson, bottom line, was underrepresentation. Like, how do you have a community that's something like 75% Black, but the Black turnout is something like 12%? And then they wonder, well, why do we only have white mayors, city councilmen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It shouldn't take a Michael Brown for them to wake up, and then all of a sudden their government, the local government, instantly became diverse overnight, and we just had to give a shit.
And don't forget your DA elections. But everybody, with that, I am sad to say that we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. Connor, especially you, I'm glad that you were able to join this program since you have direct experience with this. Wordy, pleasure as always. Travis, you are always welcome to come on the program anytime. So thank you again so much. And as we say at Crowdsourced Politics, keep your head up through the political storm.
All right. Catch you guys. Got to dip. See you later. Pleasure speaking with you.
Bye, guys.